Alright, so now we're heading into the ending, and there's going to be a lot for us to sort of decipher here, and I hope I can get through it at a pace that is both sort of brisk and understandable. So we're going to learn this main character's name here in a moment, the sort of head of all these tribesmen, but I'm just going to say it anyway right now. This is Lord Aemon, and the first thing we want to note when we see him is we want to look at the symbol on his cloak once this door opens right here. In this section, we're going to be looking at imagery a lot and sort of drawing some conclusions. The image on his cloak is largely similar to the images of the sigils that we see, so now we finally have an explicit connection between Wander's people and the sigils on the Colossi. Some of Wander's clothing might have evoked some of that imagery, but now we have sort of a more explicit connection into that realm. The masks here are very important too. Eamon's mask is unique. You can unlock it through the time trial mode, and even though that's sort of like an extra textual thing, which I really don't like imposing upon our view of the text, once we kind of look at that and apply it to this, we start to understand who Eamon is and why he's so important. So the mask that he is wearing is a shaman's mask. We know it's that because we can unlock it, and that's what it's called. So now we begin to understand the structure of the society of Wander's people, where he's explicitly called Lord, he's a shaman, he is associated with magic and a position of power, and it helps us understand just sort of the general hierarchy of the society. And then also all these other people have masks, and we might want to see those masks as sort of denoting status or rank, because in order for us to get those masks within the game, again, sort of going to an extra textual level, or some larger sort of meta text within the text, I don't know the right term for it, any masks that we unlock are done through trials, they're done through gameplay feats, they're done through sort of feats of explicit strength, and that means potentially that these people that we see have all earned their masks. Wander doesn't start the game with one. Wander starts the game without one. So now we understand where Wander falls on the sort of scale of that society. Masks interest me a lot because masks are associated with ritual all over the world, right? So Yoruba culture and Yugungun ceremonies, masks are used to communicate with gods. The Native American cultures had a ton of mask usage, some like the false faces of the Iroquois. Masks tend to be representations of gods, or they tend to be sort of ways that we can communicate with gods. Masks are also used in performance arts, still are. And here, if we look at the scene, we might want to consider the scene a type of pantomime. All we need to do is remove the subtitles, and we're sort of in the realm of like pure theater, right? We don't need to understand the language. It's sort of like we're watching a commedia dell'arte piece, even though we're not dealing with something as sort of light and heavily archetypal, but the use of masks in this game is very fascinating to me. So here we finally get to see Wander after he's made it to the end of his quest, and we finally get to see the horns that he sprouts, and most directly this is supposed to make us think of Eco, and that is intentional. But for now we need to shove that all the way to the side and consider images of horned deities or entities in other myth. Let's pause for a moment and establish that Eamon recognizes Wander and they have some sort of connection. Wander understands how the magic swords work and knows how forbidden spells work. Eamon has a connection to him. Perhaps he's a student of Eamon's. I'm not really ready to talk about my explicit thoughts about what the story might be. I'm probably going to do that in an epilogue. Let's get back to the matter of horns and horned demons. The most obvious one to think about is Satan, but I think that's really far too simplistic. It ties into the notion of Dorman as evil, but it's really way too obvious of a read to be interesting, so we should probably try and look elsewhere. So there's a horned god in some common Wiccan theology that's associated with nature, hunting, and the life cycle, among other things, and all of that are things that are important within the narrative of this game. We engage with nature, we hunt colossi, and Dorman is connected with life and death, and we might want to consider sort of Eastern usages of horns as well. So when I think of horns, I think of kuwagata, which are horns on warriors, kabuto, which are these sort of like samurai helmets, right? We've sort of seen them before, and there's not necessarily a demonic association, specifically when I talk about Kubagata, because those are deer horns, but there might be some notion of conflict, and that also ties back again to our notion of sort of masks or sort of cultural items that warriors might wear, so like this mask right here. It's not really the strongest way to look at it, but I think it is a very interesting one that sort of makes us think about what the masks might mean. It's sort of hard to say. There's other myths that have people that have horns in them. So Pan from Greek myth is associated with the hunt. That's not a particularly deep well for us to look through. I think that the Wiccan angle plus the traditional demonic imagery is a better route to go. Noting that the Wiccan angle, the horned god, so far as my understanding of it goes, is not like an evil god. So my Wiccan knowledge might be wrong there. Let's ignore that for now. This is a great moment, the point of view shot from Wander looking at Mono, because you probably didn't hear it, but when he looks at Mono, the sound from the sword, it makes the same sound that emanates when you hold it up to the light. So there's this really strong contrast being made between Mono as somebody who's associated with this sound of light and all this light around her, and now Wander, who when he dies literally has his body consumed by blackness the same way that the Colossi do when they die. There's a very big contrast between Wander's goal, Mono and what she represents, and Wander as the thing he has now become. And we dwell on that for a moment and just sort of consider that sort of contrast between light and dark, where the thing that is now dark is actually the player's character. We talked about that a little bit before in the last section, but here it gets blown to like really sweeping epic proportions, because now Dorman is going to seize upon Wander's body and take up the rest of his soul and sort of be released once again into the world. Dorman has those traditional demonic qualities that we see with the horns and that we were sort of just talking about before. This is some expository stuff. Dorman was explicitly sealed away either by Eamon or Eamon's people. That's up to the player to decide again, but we now know for sure, if we somehow didn't understand it by now, that Dorman was explicitly sundered into multiple pieces and sealed away. The question I might have is what the significance of 16 might mean. I'll leave that to other people to sort of look up and come to a conclusion about. And we also see those shadows walking into Dorman, and it stresses Dorman as a collective being again. So if we understand Dorman as this large collective mass of souls. And now we get what is possibly one of the greatest inversions of gameplay in any game ever. And I don't say that lightly, because now we're playing as Dorman. Now we are playing as a Colossus. It's not the most subtle of things that's done, but it is a very huge gameplay inversion. Moving around as Dorman is very difficult. It's very hard to have the camera cooperate. It's hard to move in a way that makes attacking Eamon and his men viable. But more importantly, we are playing as what is essentially the shadow of the Colossus. This is a shadow comprised of all the souls from the Colossi that were killed. And that's like a really simple thing to be like, oh, it's the shadow of the Colossus. But you have to understand that that's like, if we want to look into the meaning of the title, it's not just the shadow that the Colossus cast, it's the shadow that we become as we sort of go on our journey. You'll see here that moving is very difficult, and the change in motion, the change in gameplay, the change in how our controller works and how everything works exerts, once again, in a very real way, a sort of ludic pressure, right? The rules of the space have changed, and they have changed in such a fundamentally different way that we are, as players, given a certain feeling. Whether that feeling is an odd form of empowerment, a sort of distance, or disgust even. Moving around as Dorman is really difficult, so disgust might even be something that we feel. And whether or not that shift in the ludic component is sort of meant to evoke a clear, like, literal disgust in us is sort of up for us to sort of figure out again. But there is a very clear shift in the gameplay there, if even for a little bit. but it is important for us to take note of. And we also should note that the music that played there was also the music that played during our battle with Malice, where we were talking about the notion of a ritual being sundered. This might seem like a really convenient thing for Eamon to do, the way that he's going to sort of seal up and combat Dorman, but I think it's symbolically very important. So Wander, on his quest, when he takes up this sword, what he does with it is he finds all of his targets, and in order to free Dorman, he finds all the Colossi and kills them and kills them and kills them and stabs all these creatures. In order for Eamon to seal away Dorman, Eamon tosses his sword away. He doesn't really sit and try and fight. He tosses his sword down, and that's the thing that defeats Dorman. Whereas the thing that freed Dorman was this large cycle of conflict that we perpetuated throughout the entire game. All Eamon has to do, in the course of a cutscene, mind you, even, not even the course of any real gameplay, is to just throw the sword away. Give up that power, cast it aside forever, and that's all it takes for him to really exert a force over Wander and over Dorman. Whereas we, as players, spent all of this time playing, trying to exert power and influence over the game world through killing. Eamon doesn't have to do that. He just tosses away the weapon and can all of a sudden create massive power that we could only dream of. And this is our last bit of control within the game. And we almost have no control. Our objective is in front of us, the person we want to save is in front of us, and all we can do is sort of helplessly rush forward and struggle as much as we can against the sort of looming inevitability of our demise. Our quest is at an end, and there is nothing we can do about it. We can hold on to these stairs, and it will last as long as my grip gauge will last, but no matter what I do, there is an entire, very real inevitability to what is happening here. I have gone on my quest, I have presumably failed, and that failure is highlighted by taking away my agency as a player. Wander's agency as an actor and as a character are both denied because of sort of the failings that he has taken part in. If that makes any sense. If we understand character as Wander, as the character within the space, and then actor for Wander being the player-controlled avatar, agency is denied both to Wander as a character and to the player-controlled avatar. We cannot avoid our fate. And it's very powerful, and it's a very smart use of mechanics. Instead of just like leaving us with a cutscene, it actually makes us play out those moments and feel those moments. We should note that just for sort of an image recall thing here, this image sort of calls to mind the image we had when Agro died, or fell into the chasm at the very least. These horses are sort of doing the same thing that Agro did, running away from those collapsing segments of the bridge. And it's this thing where the game, and it doesn't do it very often, but it will set up an image, and it will take that image again later on, but have it in a different context. So with Agro, it was this sort of bit of self-sacrifice. With here, it's not necessarily self-sacrifice, because these horses, they're not throwing their riders, off to protect them, but what they are doing are they're still running away and sort of saving their riders. That's a really strange thing to note, but it's this notion of, we saw a miniature version of that thing, and we see it here again, except it's sort of remixed. But we do see that despite whatever else that happened, Mono has awakened. And so, whereas when we had our control taken away from us, we thought that our quest had failed. Now we wait a little bit and we see that at least nominally our objective has been achieved. Albeit at an incredibly high cost. Not just in terms of losing our player avatar and losing our control over the game space, but also the larger costs that we've talked about in the previous section. we sit back and we wonder exactly what significance does Mono hold in this space, in this world, particularly now that she is apparently alone. Dorman is sealed up. Eamon is gone. The bridge that takes people to this land is deserted. And so we have to wonder what that all means for Mono as a figure. But here we do have the return of Agro, which is never quite fully explained, but might be another thing we might attribute to Dorman to some degree, or just to some sort of larger spiritual resilience on Agro's part. But I think it is important that we have Agro, who is a character we bonded with and came to care for, at least interact with Mono to some degree. Particularly insofar as Agro is some sort of stand-in, at least at the moment, for Wander. There's a connection being made between, a character that we cared about. Agro, I think we do come to care for. And Mono, somebody who we don't fully understand as an individual because she's deprived of so much real expression in the game world. And now she's sort of free and with... and we know she's not alone, and there's comfort in that. And we're not entirely done. There's actually quite a bit more to talk about, but I'm trying to collect my thoughts here. We see all of the bodies of the Colossi that we've slain, and they sort of have doubled over and become one with nature. And we have that sort of film grain over it. And the question that we need to ask, which is something I brought up in the last section to a degree, is... Alright, there were these great battles that took place, there's this great story that occurred, this sort of legendary tale, this sort of modern epic, and yet what we're left with in the credits is this very sobering, at least on an existential level, bit of imagery where these dead bodies just exist in the space, will be overrun by nature, and this whole quest, this whole sort of journey, and the world that it took place in time might be entirely forgotten, which is a very melancholic thing to consider, but within sort of what this story is trying to tell us about, the dangers of everything that's happening is that there's two things that happen, right? There's sort of a mythic level on which things occur, and then a sort of real world level on which they occur as well. So these were mythical beings, but they were also just creatures in space, right? The same way that, if we want to argue, each human being is a wonderful, beautiful thing with a soul, right? If we really want to argue that, some people might disagree, but maybe it's true. Maybe there's some wonderful fundamental truth in the universe where we are beautiful, luminous beings, and we are magical and we are wonderful, right? But at the same time, there's that opposite coin where we are mortal and we are fragile and we are weak, and when we die, we will return to the earth the same way that the Colossi do. Whatever magic that we hold goes elsewhere. And that's me getting really romantic and poetic for a moment, but I think that a lot of the things that this game wants to ask us, are some existential questions. What is the value of an act? What is the importance of one person, right? So why is Mono more important than everybody else? What is the singular importance of what we are doing? Is there any importance at all? It's hard to tell. And now we have this sort of land cut off from the rest of the world, an island of magic, sort of now turned dead. And I do like the sentiment here expressed by Eamon, which is this notion of finding atonement or finding redemption. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get towards the end of this video. But for now, we should just note that the ending, I think, wants us to see both the meta higher level thing of, here was a place where a, a boy battled magical god beings in order to save someone he loved, but it's also, there's this other level of, this is a world where a man went on a hunt killing creatures that have withered and wasted away, and this story might be one that will ultimately be forgotten to the annals of time, whether that is within the historical context of the world in the text or even outside of the text. Years from now, people might not even remember this story. People might not experience it. It might not be around. It's a very true thing that we need to consider. And here we have a child with horns, and it's left for us to interpret whether or not that is Wander, whether or not that is sort of the beginning of the horned line of children from Eco. And Eco, again, not necessary to understanding this piece, but still very important to looking at this piece to one degree or another. But for now, let's just consider that it's Wander, and let's say that maybe he's being given a chance to atone for his sins, and those horns are a mark, showing his sinful nature, and over time he will get the chance to redeem himself, and so he is somehow reincarnated now, and will grow up and get a chance to redeem himself, and perhaps even that redemption, if we do want to look outside of this text, is eventually achieved by the events of Eco. If we want to read these two pieces together, that's probably a fair read. I think so anyway. We want to consider the significance of Mono as a maternal figure. It's very strange because the society that Mono and Wander and Eamon hail from is very clearly patriarchal. But we have Mono here as a pure figure, but a mother figure as well, and it's very hard for me to sit down and figure out exactly what might be going on with that image. It might just be that we were meant to associate more softness with her, especially as Agro and she enter into this sort of Garden of Eden space. The deer image right there is one I generally associate with Mono because it's an image of gentleness, but we should also remind ourselves that deers have antlers, and antlers are basically just horns in a different form. And yearly, deers will shed their antlers. And if we want to think about the notion of regeneration and redemption and reincarnation, when we see the apparent rebirth of Wander, there's a cyclical idea to what's going on here. A new life, a new chance, and maybe an opportunity for Wander to sort of shed his horns the same way that the deer sheds its antlers. And we have a return to the hawk image in a way that I think is very significant. Not just because hawks are something that we have chosen, or I have chosen, if we're talking about the notion of semiotic processes and attributing meaning to certain things. I've chosen to see the hawk as a symbol of the soul. Here we get to see it soar away and into this magical world. And the music here is very beautiful and very uplifting. And it's this idea of a soul of some kind ascending into space and sort of soaring free. And we don't need to sit back and say, like, whose soul is it? It's just this notion of souls being free somehow. Of there maybe being some sort of value in this quest. Mono is has been woken, and this hawk sails into the sky. And I think maybe that's all the visual association we need, is something like that. It doesn't need to be anything thought, too heavily about, we achieved our goal, Mono is saved. The symbol of purity has sort of been released back into the world, and the hawk sort of flies free. Although the hawk enters back into a dark space, and we're going to sort of end where we began. We saw a hawk sailing in the darkness in the nighttime at the beginning of the game, and now we pull in and we get that same image again, where we sort of get that image of regeneration and rebirth and another cycle once again. And that is Shadow of the Colossus. I hope you enjoyed this series. Thank you very, very much. I thank you for sharing this with me.